Hello ladies and gentlemen, Nick here. Welcome one and all to my review of one of my favourite stories of all time, The Tomb of the Cybermen, the first story from Doctor Who Season 5. And so, let's get started. The story begins with Victoria's first scene in the TARDIS. As I mentioned in my Season 4 ranking, it was moved from the Eve of the Daleks to this story. And you get a nice couple of minutes with them in the TARDIS, talking, and Victoria getting introduced. And you get quite a lot of Second Doctor and Jamie teamwork. You can tell in Eve of the Daleks they were pretty much a team. They had their arguments, but they worked together really well. And the same way in the Faceless ones. And it's around those two stories and this story where you get to see the Doctor and Jamie being the best of friends and working together as a team, more so than probably any story before. And this is the dynamic that we'll see throughout the rest of the Troughton era. So, get used to this dynamic, people. Victoria, on the other hand, isn't involved with the two as much, but she is loyal to them, and she's a great friend of them. Anyway, after the TARDIS scene, we get to see the side characters, basically, on the expedition to Telos, the Cybermen's adopted planet, as the Sixth Doctor will call it in Attack of the Cybermen. Another one of my favourites. And in this, although the people here seem to think this is their homeworld, as I mentioned, adopted planet. They later mentioned that the Second Doctor blew up the original planets. As I mentioned in the Season 4 ranking, that was pretty much just the Doctor saying, let the planet absorb all the energy and then it'll blow up, basically. So the expedition team is trying to discover the remains of the Cybermen. They just want to have a look around, basically. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing sinister going on here, apart from with 3 of them. Yes, as besides the Cybermen, we've got 3 human villains. Well, 2 of them that are completely villainous and one who becomes an ally later on, but more on him later. But I'll just say that it is Eric Klieg, Master of the World. You know, that guy that Aimless Wanderings expanded the character on a lot in their audios. The one that is always going saying Master of the insert something here, e.g. Master of the World. And he is pretty much the main villain other than the Cyber Lead Controller and the Cybermen. Cyber Controller, did you say? Yes, I'll get round to him later. The other villains are Kaftan, who is a slightly toned down version of Klieg, but is still really full in her ways, centred on completing their mission. And the other is Toberman, who is the one who becomes an ally later on, and he's basically a silent servant for the most parts. He gets a couple of lines in, but he's mostly relying on his facial and physical body language to portray the character. And I would say the Cybermen have done a very similar thing, and there's quite a lot of great moments where the Second Doctor is talking to Toberman and the Cybermen, and he's talking, and then they move, and then Patrick Troughton, like that, says his next line. It's super quick. I think Patrick Troughton has rehearsed those scenes so well. He knows those scenes back to front. He does such a great job in those scenes. In fact, I'll just take the moment now to say Patrick Troughton is at his best in this story. This is definitely the best Troughton performance so far. And there is one particular scene in Part 3 where it probably is his best scene ever. I agree with Mr. TARDIS Reviews. I went to rewatch his review on this story afterwards, and I agree with many of his points, especially that Troughton scene in Part 3, which I'll talk about more because that's one of my favourite scenes, not just in the story, but in the entire series show. The Doctor, Jamie and Victoria land on Telos and they decide to help out the crew at the archaeological dig. And part 1 is basically just being on the planet and looking around a bit. It's actually quite interesting considering there's not much going on besides a couple of death traps. But the interactions between the characters are just so good. It makes what could have been a dull part 1 interesting and enjoyable, and it actually goes at a fast pace, to be honest. I mean, when they were doing stuff in one of the rooms with Hayden, I think it was, and Jamie, it was about the 17-minute mark, and I was like, wow, 17 minutes? That was quick. It didn't feel that long. It felt more like 10 or 11 or 12 at most, but it was 17. We were nearly at the end of part 1, or at least over the halfway mark. It was, of the episodes, that is. It was really, really good, and I just had a good time with it. In fact, I've seen this story so much, I didn't even have to pay that much attention this time round. I know this story very well. But that didn't stop me from having a good time with it, especially the second half, which I'll get round to in a bit. The first half is great, showing the Doctor and companions interacting with these other characters, both good and eventually turning out to be bad. Although at the start they're just acting a bit prickish, a bit not so nice, but then they reveal to be villains about halfway through part 2. And then by the end of part 2, Klieg reveals his true motives, to have the Cybermen as his allies so that he can take over. And Kaftan is going to help them. And then under part 2, Klieg releases the Cybermen from their tombs when they discovered them. And yeah, the Cybermen aren't really that interested in helping Klieg. In fact, they just want to convert everybody. Instead of trying to take over the world, the Cybermen's main goal in this story, besides converting everyone into Cybermen, is to just survive. And the story introduces the Cyber Controller, who New Who series fans will know from The Age of Steel. Also, Attack of the Cybermen has this Cyber Controller, although in its worst design, to be honest. Just a big bulgy head. Doesn't even show the brain. At least with Russell T Davies, the handlebars design, and then having the Cyberman with the showing the brain and the glowy, the light eyes, that looked much better. It actually looked like a grand version of the new version of the Cybermen that we got in the story. And this one also looks like a more grand version of the type of Cybermen we get in this story, but the Attack of the Cybermen one just looks like one of the normal ones, but losing his handlebars and having a big bulgy head. And it's a little bit red around the top, but more on that on that review. But yeah, the Cyber Controller, interesting how we can get to see the brain. It's slightly bulgy, but it looks more natural here than on the Attack of the Cybermen one. And he looks really good. He looks really great. Do we have a picture of him here? Yeah, here we go. It's this picture here. He looked great. At least as great as the Cybermen of this story can look. Yeah, slightly better picture here. But yeah, he's actually a pretty devious character as well, but what they mostly want to do is survive, basically, and part 3 is mainly focused to start off with on the Cybermen, and then part 4 is on trying to is Klieg's plan for the Cyber Controller, but Toberman has been partly converted into a Cyberman at this point, muscle-wise anyway. But eventually, they just have the Cyber Controller captive, and they try to make a bargain, but Kaftan is killed by the Cyber Controller. And soon I think Toberman, still having his emotions, then nearly kills the Cyber Controller, and then Klieg tries to bargain with the other Cybermen at the time when the Doctor and Toberman are trying to destroy them. Thankfully, Jamie's on his way to try and help. Eventually, they seal the two Cybermen in their tomb after Klieg is killed by one of them. And eventually, the Cyber Controller is revealed to be alive, and Toberman sacrifices himself to keep him trapped in the tomb, despite being electrified by the doors in the process. and the Cyber Controller is presumed dead, but there's a bit at the end that kind of hints maybe he's not, and Attack of the Cybermen reveals he's merely damaged. So he will probably go back to his tomb or something to be frozen until the Cybermen and Attack of the Cybermen come along. So I basically skipped over most of the plot, but that's basically the gist of the story. You've also got the introduction of the Cybermats, which New Who series fans will know from the story Closing Time. And these are kind of like woodlice slash mice. Woodlice was the inspired design, but by the new series, they're a bit more like rats. So they're basically like woodlice and rats moving around the tomb. The tomb. There isn't that much threat from them. I mean, they're supposedly partly cyber. They don't turn in people. They're supposedly turn people to give cybernetics, I suppose, like Toberman. But as Mr. TARDIS reviews said in his review, there isn't that much threat from them. I think we'll get to see a bit more of what the Cybermats are more capable of in their future appearances in The Wheel in Space, in Revenge of the Cybermen, in Closing Time, and also the game Blood of the Cybermen. And probably other adventures as well. But they do work effectively here as a danger. It's just that we don't actually see what they're capable of, apart from possibly being what gave Toberman for some cybernetic limbs as part of his conversion, or part conversion anyway. But other than that, we'll have to wait and see what the Cybermats are more capable of in future stories. They're back in the Wheel in Space at the other end of the season, so we'll get that. At some points, they also look a bit squishy, but of course they're metal. The movements are really good, though. I admire how they move across the floor and jump up onto a person. And speaking of movements, there is one bit where you see Toberman's wires when he is being thrown across the room by a Cyberman in Part 3. But according to Mr. TARDIS in a little caption, that was apparently due to the restoration on the story. I don't think it would have been on the 1991 video, as he said it was a rushed VHS release, so there probably wasn't as much restoration done on that as, say, the Enemy of the World and the Web of Fear DVDs in 2013 and 2014. Or Galaxy 4 Part 3 on the Aztec Special Edition release, or the Underwater Menace Part 2 on its release. So the reconstruction, you could say, was probably rushed, though, but the episode restoration, that was probably normal. That was fine. So maybe they didn't take as much time on the restoring the Tomb of the Cybermen back when it was found as when, say, it came to DVD, or for its Special Edition DVD. And he had Mr. TARDIS had the original DVD release on him, so certainly by then. But despite that, it would have looked pretty cool without those wires. Whoops, never mind. Another great bit is in Part 4 where Toberman gets his own back on, I think the Cyberman that does kill Cleek, and he rips the chest open and goo spills out. And this started... this is one of the things in the 60s where people were getting a bit concerned that Doctor Who was getting a bit too scary for children. And there was actually this one guy who actually said maybe it's too scary for the parents. That was quite comedic. So, yeah, I think that was one of the earliest things people had a problem with. I think it was pretty cool, and I like how they managed to do it as a practical way of doing it. I think it looks really great. And the same for the tombs melting and unmelting. It looks really cool in a practical sense. And these have some great sets. And unlike, say, Macro Terror, where you're stuck on these sets quite a lot and not really exploring anywhere else, in this story, the scenes are written to only feature these few number of sets. But the story around them and the character interactions within them, it works so well. Less is more. Less can be more if used correctly and used right. And this story uses the less is more situation really, really well. I will get back to positives in a few minutes, but first of all, I want to point out some nitpicks and negative points about the story. It's not a completely perfect story. First of all, being a product of the time, as Mr. TARDIS reviews stated, this story has been does feature some mild racism and sexism, although I might extend that latter to moderate. There is a few. The women are usually told to stay up top, and at no point do either of them go down. By the way, there's only 2 female characters in this entire story, Kaftan and Victoria. Yeah, one's a villain and one's a companion. You don't get any other female characters. Yay. I don't think the next story does either, but has any female characters other than Victoria, to be honest. Actually, the previous one had 2 other, at least. Yeah. 60s weren't the best times to write women, and you can clearly see it in a couple of scenes in this story where they say, oh, the women should stay upstairs. Oh, no, it's not too dangerous for you. Oh, you shouldn't be left alone. You should just stay here. How would you know, honey? Is he always like that? Oh, most of the time, yeah, Vic. Those last 2 lines were comments that they were following up the one before. Yes, a couple of sexist comments, or borderline anyway. It is 60s thinking. Even the Doctor has some slight, I would say, thinking this way, but I will say his is more of a caring side, and also not trusting of Kaftan. But certainly in 60s writing, there is that undertone of they're not really wanting the girls to go into anything dangerous or really that have much to do with the plot, apart from Kaftan being the villain and her side of what their plot is going to do, and Victoria getting a bit more to do in this story because it's her first proper one. But outside of that, they don't really write them that well. Victoria does scream quite a lot, but she's okay. She doesn't do terrible amounts, but she does a good job in the second and third stuff. But she's not a bad character. I mean, she gets worse as the show goes along. But here she's good, and Kaftan is okay, but not that memorable. She's basically Eric Lee, but tones down, and not that memorable. She doesn't go around screaming that she's the mistress of the universe at any point. So, yeah. Although there is a mention of her in Aimless Wanderings at one point. So, yeah, but that's more for nostalgia and fan service, rather than making a comedic character out of a fan-loved one. Unlike Eric Klieg, master of the world. Or universe, whichever he prefers. And as for the racism tones, I suppose maybe more so for the fact that Toberman is a servant and he's big and strong and silent. But that's about as far as I can see. Toberman is honestly my favourite character outside the Doctor and Jamie in this story, and as Mr. TARDIS says, the one that has the most character development, as we see him from what we mentioned here to being the one who eventually saves the day in the end. So, yeah. So despite some problems with Toberman, not personal ones, but some that other people might have, he turns out to be one of the best characters. And there's less of those racism notices than the sexism ones. The sexism one I noticed a little bit more often, and it kind of got a bit more grating on this rewatch, as I noticed them a bit more so. But they weren't direct insults or anything. It's like in the Celestial Toymaker, there was the N-word used, but in a nursery rhyme context. Therefore, it wasn't intentionally being insultive to any person in particular. In this story, there is at no point are either insultive, apart from maybe Captain Hopper's remark at Victoria in Part 3, but when he's about to go down the hatch. But besides that, potentially that, it's just a couple of typical 60s writing undertones that just got a bit more grating on the latest rewatch. But as a product of its time, it makes sense, even if it's a bit annoying for a current audience, but you've got to accept it in a little bit anyway. And it's not directly insultive, so I'm not going to press on the matter anymore. Now, had they directly insulted Victoria, Kaftan, or Toberman for being a woman or black, then we've got a problem. But at this point in time, but here it's just slight ideology undertones. If only television would stop projecting stuff that was happening at the times in their content and just showed characters doing stuff. Anyway, so besides those little problems, this story is still really great, and yeah, a couple of 60s stuff, but imagine a story from 2018 and you saw it in, let's say, about 30, 40 years' time. You would think some of the stuff going on there doesn't quite fit with your ideologies in 2050-ish. Say 2050, racism and sexism is abolished by this point, and you saw the woman who fell to earth, and you thought, why isn't the black people getting more screen time? Even though I think they got quite a good amount of screen time in that particular story. Okay, maybe that's not a good example. I think maybe imagine how disgusted we are at the actions of the Americans during the segregation era, as seen in Rosa. Imagine if the 2050 people of the 2050s were, as I said, they abolished racism, abolished sexism completely, and they saw that episode and they're like, well, to be honest, they would know its historical context. Okay, maybe the Series 11 stories aren't the best examples, because Series 11 is a bit more progressive than some series. Some people would say a bit too progressive, but oh well. And when I say some people would say too progressive, I mean the ones who go out call it out for being too PC. So yeah, can we change that to PR, progressive, PG, progressive? Yeah, I know, they're all 12s, but apart from one, but we can hope. The only other little nitpick I have with this story, besides some 60s undertones being a bit more noticeable and grating, is, as Mr. Tardis said, the supporting characters besides Toberman aren't that great. Whilst I did like Professor Perry, was it? Yeah, Professor Perry. The other characters are made up of red shirts or not just there, or just there. There's a couple of characters die, so there's some working people. The guy who opens the doors. Hayden, I think. Hayden and Viner, I think. Viner himself getting killed by Mr. Cleek, and then also Callum almost gets killed by Cleek as well, and he has to be helped to get back to the rocket ship with by Hopper. And I think there's a few other some other engineers. There's definitely one other engineer who's helped fixing the rocket as well, and there must be one or two other people. There's not that. By the time the story ends, there's only a few survivors of the incident. Well, half the expedition team is either dead or, dead. But the character interactions between the two characters are really interesting and they're very entertaining. And so I can forgive that. Forgive the typical stereotypes of the characters. That's another point Mr. Tardis brought out. Alongside the undertone racism and sexism of the time, there was also, you got stereotyped typical characters, and the villains fall under this the most. So yeah, again, as I mentioned, you have to take it at face value. A story from its time, 1967, so very different to 2019, or even 2010, or even 1991. So yeah, despite all that, the Tomb of the Cybermen still is still a brilliant story. And now back to the positive stuff. Acting is brilliant, especially from our villains. Especially George Pastel, who Bond fans will know was the conductor in From Russia with Love. And he does a great job as Eric Klieg. I do think Benji Clifford does an even better job in the audios. But, yeah, well, Benji Clifford is Benji Clifford. George Pascal does a great job here, as does Shirley Cookson, I think, as Kaftan. I think she's supposed to be Russian by the sounds of it. At least both of them sound Eastern European, at least. Toberman, as I mentioned, The actor playing him is great. He has to show more physical action rather than vocal. And the supporting cast, they're all good in the roles they're given, and they do great jobs. And the main cast are great. As I said, Patrick Troughton's best performance so far, Fraser Hines' best performance so far as well. Then Deborah Watling's starting to get... I think she's on the same lines as Eve of the Daleks, but I think... Yeah, as someone who's just entered this universe, it makes a lot of sense. I think she will get better as we go along. Not so much the character, but the actress would. But still still good performances. And the Cybermen are just brilliant. This story would have worked without the Cybermen, but it may not have been as interesting. But the Cybermen help to spice up the story once we get to the halfway point, and that's what really delivers. So, despite some nitpicks, we've got quite a lot of great stuff in it. And before we get to the conclusion and the score, I just have to talk about one more scene that's within the last 5 minutes of part 3. And it's probably one of my favourite scenes of the entire show. And that's when the second Doctor and Victoria are talking about their families. The Victoria can't sleep when she's on watch, and she doesn't wake the Doctor for his turn. And they have a nice little conversation about Victoria being happy with them, but she misses her father. And she and the Doctor talk about her families, which ends with the famous "Our lives are very different" speech, or quote from the Doctor. And that bit in particular, oh god, I'm tearing up about it, just thinking about it. Patrick Troughton, this is Patrick Troughton's best performance. That one scene, those few lines, that one quote, possibly not even his best performance so far, it's the Doctor at his best at this point, completely. It will be a long time before we get a moment like this again. Whilst there are great quotes and great performances from other Doctors, and also from Troughton himself as well, later down the line, it will be a long time before any quote or any speech will match or even top this one. And yeah, say what you like about the Capaldi ones, but he can definitely pull these types of speeches off. But whether any of those are as good as this one, I'm not quite certain. Maybe the Dr. Falls one. Another Cyberman story, ironically, but at this point in time, and certainly until, I don't know, maybe the end of Survival at least, that one has also a really great a really great quote. But certainly at least until then, there will not be another, or at least it will be a long time until there's another story to have a scene or a quote or a line or a performance as good as Patrick Troughton's Our Lives line, Our Lives quote in this story. I just love it. I got a bit teary, as you saw earlier, just thinking about it, and I was getting a bit teary every time I watched that scene. I can't remember what spot it was on my Happy Clones top 10 moments list. It must have been in the top 5. I'll go back in time and kill him a second time if he hasn't put it in the top 5. It's definitely in the top 10 somewhere. But oh god. It's so beautiful. I'll have to finish this review, or otherwise I'll start crying over how good it is. Okay, so Tomb of the Cybermen, despite some little problems around some of the writing of the time, such as the character stereotypes, the minor sexism and racism, and basically the undertones of the time, despite all that, it's a brilliant story. It's more than brilliant. It's an outstanding story. This is so good. The characters, despite stereotypes, interact really well with each other. So you can put that aside and just have some fun characters, even if they're not especially well written. They still have especially well written stuff to say or do. The stuff with the Cybermen is brilliant, and it racks up the tension more as we get more of them. And it's got a nice, solid 4-part story with some especially great moments thrown in, and possibly the best scene of Doctor Who for a long, long time in Part 3's, with that scene I've just been talking about. So, yeah, despite some noticeable but minor problems with a bit of the writing, but everything else is gold. Or silver, in this case. Or metal grey. But The Tomb of the Cybermen is the best Doctor Who story at this point in Doctor Who's history. In 1967, the start of Season 5, it is the best Doctor Who story of all time. And I think I must have mentioned this in one of the previous reviews. But I don't think there's going to be another story that's going to be as good as this story until... Well, I think there's going to be plenty of ones that are as good, but I don't think we're going to get any better until we get to 1979's City of Death. But until then, we'll still get great stories, don't get me wrong. We've still got the Daemons and the Ark in Space to come as well, amongst others. But at this point in time, this is the gold standard of Doctor Who, despite some minor problems in the writing of the times, but apart from that, funnily enough, it's this story that has more writing of the times than some of the other stories. Yeah, this one, the the best one so far, has those undertones when quite a few of the other ones don't really have that, at least not as noticeable anyway. Yeah, it's always the good ones, isn't it? It's always the good ones that do this. It's never the bad ones. Or the not so good ones, anyway. So, anyway, that's it from my review of the Tomb of the Cybermen, and I'm going to quickly round up the review by scoring this story a 10 out of 10. Yeah, despite minor problems, it is still one of my favourite stories of all time. Like I said, it's the best one at this point in time until 1979, anyway, when City of Death will come along. And that one also is a very enjoyable, short and fast-paced story. And, yeah. So, anyway, that's it from The Tomb of the Cybermen. I'm sorry it couldn't be longer. I mean, I wouldn't have wanted it to go to 6 parts, but because it was over so quickly, I mean, I did take a break out in between them to, because I was going to watch a television programme in between. So, and also watched a YouTube video on Bond 25 as well. But still, if I was still watching it as a whole story, I'd still be disappointed that it'd be over so quickly. So it's a shame. It's had to go by as a flash, and from now on, the rest of the season are 6-parters, and they're probably going to be a bit slower. Whoopee. But yeah, just a magnificent story. When I do my 100 episode tag that Matt has kind of tagged me as a member of the Universals, that's it technically, this story is definitely being completely saved. So that's it from The Tomb of the Cybermen, as I've said. Next time we'll be looking at the slightly not so good following story, The Abominable Snowmen, which part 2 of survives on this DVD box set, on disc 3 of this set, but the other 5 episodes, it's back to loose cannon for reconstructions. Yay. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye. Don't forget to click below to subscribe to the official Nicholas Payne Retro YouTube channel. Sorry about that. When has that ever stopped? When has that ever happened? And when I say most people would... And before I get to my final conclusion, I have to talk about one scene in towards the end of part 3 that I fucking love about... Can I redo that take? Okay, Tomb of the Cybermen, despite some initial problems with the stereotypes and the characterizations of some people... So, hang on. Well, I knew I'd have a lot to talk about, but wow.